Welcome to the Deep Dive,
Emerald City Hockey's Seattle Kraken podcast.
All right, RJ, it has been one heck of a day. I know you've been busy running around doing pressers, practices, all that good stuff. I've been here trying to keep track of it all, league-wide, and of course with the Kraken, hanging out with everybody on Twitter. That's been a lot of fun. But now you are back. You have eaten. So you should be ready to go. We can do this. I've eaten. I'm here. We're good. Afra's down on her bed beneath my desk. Everything is all good. We can finally start digging into all of the trades that the Seattle Kraken made at this trade deadline. Few more than we expected. And it's going to be fun as we get to talk about some of those.
Absolutely. Definitely some surprises last night and again this morning. So I'm so eager to talk about all this. This might be my favorite podcast of the season. This is right up my alley.
For sure. All right. So we're going to go chronologically through all of the deals, starting with the Calle Jarnkrok deal back on March 16th. That was, of course, Calle Jarnkrok going to the Calgary Flames in exchange for a 2022 second-round pick from Florida, a 2023 third-round pick from Calgary, and a 2024 seventh-round pick from Calgary. We talked about this a little bit on the last post-game, RJ, but, this is one of those deals that just made sense for everybody involved. Calgary gets Jarnkrok. He's going to help them out. He's going to fit perfectly into Sutter's system. Gets to go play with his cousin in Elias Lindholm. Gets to go play with his friend in Jacob Markstrom. It's just kind of a perfect deal all the way around. And then the return was great for Ron Francis.
Exactly. Perfect example of a win-win-win type of trade for both teams and then the player involved as well. Good value, I think, for the Kraken too. We talked about it beforehand, what we would accept as, kind of our benchmark for success in this deal. We agreed on a second and a fourth. Second, third, and seventh, of course, beats that. And it was interesting hearing Brad Treliving, the Flames GM, talk about it on the Jeff Merrick show the other day. And he mentioned, that the comparable trade that he looked at with this deal was the Janmark trade last year. Matthias Janmark going to Vegas, and I believe that was a second and a third, and the Sharks got a fifth for the cap element, retaining some money there. And so I asked Ron Francis about that today, and I said, Treliving mentioned, that deal was a comparable. Did you have any comparable deals for any of the ones that you made? And he said, I think I was the guy who might have told him that. Glad he agreed, and we got something done. So that was a fun little story.
Yeah, no, that is pretty great. Otherwise, there's not too much to talk about. It's just one of those deals that makes sense for both sides. Jarnkrok, along with Gio, who we'll get to in just a second, was, one of those guys that we had highlighted, felt really confident that a deal was going to get done. Got done a couple days ahead of the deadline, and, just wish him well with Calgary. He's going to have a pretty decent shot at the cup, I think, this year.
Oh yeah, for sure. They're absolutely contenders, and I think he's in a spot that he's got to feel really happy.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to point out, and I'll kind of point it out as we go, and then we can really talk about it at the end of this podcast after we've talked about all the deals individually, kind of the state of where the Kraken are. I'm going to point out that second round pick this year is from Florida. It's most likely going to be a low second round pick.
Yes.
So I do want to point that out, that yes, it's a second and then it's a third, but the third is next year again from a good team. So, that is something to remember when we talk about all these picks. Obviously a late first is not the same as an early first. The same can be said for all of the subsequent rounds as well. So just throwing that out there. Sorry if I'm going to get cynical, everybody, about that kind of stuff, but I do think it's worth mentioning when you start looking at the bigger picture. But moving on, first, going to talk about the big trade. We knew Gio was going somewhere, felt pretty good about it being Toronto. Did not expect it to also include Colin Blackwell, however. So the trade made yesterday, Mark Giordano and Colin Blackwell to the Toronto Maple Leafs. In exchange, the Kraken get 2022 second-round pick from Toronto, 2023 second-round pick also from Toronto, and the 2024 third-round pick also from Toronto. So this is a big one, RJ. We knew Gio was going to be going somewhere. Like I said, felt reasonably good about saying it was going to be Toronto. We wanted the first round pick back. I think Ron Francis wanted the first back. Instead, realistically, probably the 2 seconds with Blackwell making up that third rounder. How are we feeling about it? We talked about it briefly yesterday, but how are you feeling about it having, slept on it and with everything else?
It's a complicated trade, and there are a bunch of factors here. And I do feel differently about it today than I did yesterday. And part of that's sleeping on it, but I think most of that is hearing Ron Francis talk about the deal, how it came together, all that sort of thing. Because I felt like it was one that we couldn't fairly judge until we had heard Ron Francis' side of the story on it. And part of that is Giordano, maybe wanting to go to Toronto, and Francis did confirm that's where he wanted to go. That was his preferred destination. So I think that factored into it. It's funny, Francis was asked, what about that rumor basically that he had asked for a first round pick there. And he said, I'm trying to get first round picks in all the trades that I make, realistically, you should always ask for a first round pick. But I think what ultimately is going to decide, whether this was a good trade or not depends on your opinion on the Gio to Toronto thing. Because I think it was a little bit light on value, as we recognized at the time. And I don't know that you can necessarily even really argue with that. It's something that even, people on both sides have kind of acknowledged as far as what the value was. But there was a dynamic of it being the team's first captain, and Ron Francis likes to do right by his players. And I want to share with you this answer that Francis gave about whether or not Gio kind of used his limited no trade clause, because he had 10 teams he couldn't be traded to kind of steer a trade to Toronto, because that was another factor there, that Gio had some trade protection. So here's the quote from Francis. Gio was great. We talked about that. I said, how do you want to proceed? He said, I'm not tying your hands. You can trade me anywhere you want. I said, okay, but legally I need you to give me a no trade list. And he gave me 10 teams that weren't in the playoffs. So it was never an issue with him. He was first class the whole way through. Now that's pretty significant, because Gio, according to this, basically didn't use any of his trade protection. Trade me anywhere you want. Do what you got to do. I'm going to be a team first guy. The height of class there. And Francis, so he probably could have gotten a bigger return. He probably could have traded him elsewhere. But Francis looked at that and said, you know what? I want to send him where he wants to go. And he made sure to get a deal done with Toronto. And I mean, how do you feel about that, Dylan? Because that's certainly a trade-off there.
It is, and I'm really conflicted about it as a whole, and I think kind of my stance on everything will become more clear as we get to some of the later trades. But at first, I'm really happy about it. I want the reputation to be around the league that the Kraken are going to take care of you. If the Kraken are not in a position to be successful, they're going to help make sure you're in a position to be successful, which is ultimately what trading these guys to playoff bound teams is doing, right? They're getting to go for a chance to play for a cup. That's very significant all in of its own. But the fact that, no, we're also going to take into account what you want. Obviously, we all knew Gio wanted Toronto. He was not going to make that a sticking point for Ron Francis, but it was not a secret either. And Ron Francis did his best to honor that for Gio, because Gio was willing to, kind of take one for the team and allow Francis the room to work. On the flip side, you can say, well, look, Ron Francis's real obligation is to the Kraken. It's to the Kraken fan base to make sure that they have the best team and the most competitive team, every single year, not just this year, not just next year, but building long term. So you can argue that, we shouldn't be doing that stuff if it means that we're getting worse returns because of it. I'm in favor of, let's go ahead and build, keep good working relations with people. I think hockey, all sports, but especially hockey, is one where you never know where these people are going to end up. I can't, in the last 10 years, so many former players have become general managers elsewhere in this league, or presidents of hockey operations, assistant general managers, scouts. They all go, they all stay in hockey. They become coaches, right? I think it's totally, it's worth making little sacrifices, like, we didn't get a low first, instead we got 2 seconds. I think that's a small sacrifice to keep a good working relationship with Gio and to send the message around the league that this is how you operate. Now, I think where things get a little different, and I'll talk about this probably more so when we get to the Appleton and Johansson deals, is, they also kind of sent the message at this deadline of, if you're on an expiring deal, you're gone. And I don't know that those two messages align. as far as being player friendly entirely, but I also can't say that for sure because I don't know the conversations that went on behind closed doors between Ron Francis and all of the players on expiring deals. So overall, it is what it is. I think it could have been better, but the thing that I think still is sticking with me as part of this deal has nothing to do with Gio, and that is the loss of Colin Blackwell. Because I'd
Mhm.
been really beating the drum of I wanted to keep Colin Blackwell around long term. Francis has been talking a lot about building the core group of guys that he wants to, move forward with season after season with. I wanted Colin Blackwell to be included in that. I I loved what he's been doing with Yanni Gord. I mean, every single post game now for like 2 weeks, we have just talked about that Yanni Gord line with him, Blackwell, and Mason Appleton. I mean, we're gonna get to it, but like, how bad do we feel for Yanni Gord today, right? Everybody, like, it's rough
I
losing
know.
both of them.
Losing both his line mates, that is rough.
Yeah. Um, so and it just kind of came out of nowhere. I thought, Colin Blackwell on a extremely cheap deal, you're going to be able to re-sign him, give him a 200% increase on what he's making now. He's still going to be very reasonably priced. You know what I mean? Like, I
Mhm.
just thought he was someone that, from a locker room culture standpoint, from an on ice play standpoint, from the way he was gelling with someone we know is solidly within that core group of guys in Yanni Gord, I really thought there was a good chance that Colin Blackwell was going to be, uh, hanging around in Seattle for at least a couple more years, and to trade him and essentially have the return only be a third for that, and a third 3 years from now, like 3 drafts from now, that one, it just stings.
It does, and that's something that kind of hit us right away as we were getting ready to record, and it came out that Blackwell was going to be part of the return. We were pretty surprised to see that, and I echo a lot of your sentiments there about the culture and the right type of guy to have on the team, loving what he brought, especially with Yanni Gord, and that I know he's a pending UFA. I know you probably could not have gotten a deal done with him before the deadline, and so on paper it certainly would make sense to move him. And if you're Blackwell too, and this is tough because we don't know the conversations behind the scenes, but if you're Blackwell, I'm thinking if I'm in his skates, am I really looking to re-sign with Seattle right away before I can hear what's on the market? I don't think so. And I think Blackwell has been underutilized a lot of his tenure in Seattle. I know there was a rough start, with him missing training camp and whatnot, but I just got to think that maybe there's a team out there that's going to utilize him a little better. I know the Kraken had started to do that recently, but you've got to at least hear what other teams have to say. And so I think, Ron Francis felt he was kind of in that spot where, he's kind of forced to either get a return or basically lose him for nothing. But still, I think as far as the message that you're sending to the rest of the team, as far as what you look for, what gets rewarded, if Blackwell, was interested in staying the rest of the season, then yeah, I don't know about him being included in this trade, and I'm obviously not happy to see him go.
Yeah, like I said, and I had brought this up. I don't remember if it was on a deep dive or on one of the post game lives, really like a week and a half ago now. I'd brought up the idea of, when people were talking about Johansson and Blackwell, and the idea of just moving all of these guys on expiring deals just to make sure you got something for them. And I'd brought up the idea of, I don't know that you want to send that message to players around the league, to players on your own team, that anytime somebody's on an expiring deal, if you don't sign an extension with us, we're just going to get rid of you. You know what I mean? Like, you don't necessarily want that to be your reputation either, because it's UFA status for so many guys. Really, every NHL player is such a big deal. It's the first time you have any say in your career, right? Is the ability to become a free agent, listen to all offers on the table, and choose where you go. Otherwise, you're drafted by someone who then has team control over you essentially until you're 27 at least, if you don't sign a longer term extension. It's a long time. It's the first 9 years of your career. You're just stuck with whoever drafted you or whoever they trade you to. So I get why UFA is such a big deal for these guys. At the same time, I feel like, you know, I don't know. Like I said, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way that we just essentially dumped all the UFAs, all the RFAs that we could at the deadline, just to make sure we got something, even if that return in some cases might have been minimal, such as with this Blackwell one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not necessarily against trying to, get as many assets as you can for UFAs and even RFAs that you don't view as part of the core. I think I'm a little bit more to that side of it than you are,
Hmm.
that it's okay. And certainly, a guy like Johansson, I know you talked about the importance of unrestricted free agency. He's been there, he's done that a few times, and he's kind of bounced around. And I bet you he probably was, sent to a spot that he likes. We'll talk about that later,
Yeah,
but I don't necessarily mind that message if the team has performed poorly, which I mean, gosh, they're near last place in the
yeah,
league. They
they
have. You
have.
can't really argue with that. So given that the team performance, when you're that far down in the standings, I think it's okay to maybe send a message that no one is safe. That's not necessarily how you're going to run things always, but if the results are how they have been, I don't have an issue with it. But Blackwell is one of those players where, given the effort that he put in, given what he showed night in, night out, that's where I might have an issue.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's the one that kind of gets me, and like I said, that's the duality that I brought up before too, when I was talking about the Geo thing. I totally get it. As I was said before with Ron Francis with the Geo trade, Ron Francis's real obligation is to the fan base. It's to the Kraken. So yes, getting rid of somebody that you don't think you're going to be able to re-sign, get literally whatever you can for him because that's better than nothing. It's just one of
Yeah.
those that I don't know. In certain situations like this, with certain players like him, to essentially get a mid-round pick 3 years from now, it feels very like you literally got all, the only thing you could for him. It doesn't feel like you got a ton for him. The way that this next trade feels like, RJ, and that is, of course, Jeremy Lauzon going to the Nashville Predators in exchange for Nashville's second-round pick in this year's upcoming draft. This one completely caught me by surprise given how utilized Lauzon has been this year through all of his ups and downs. I really thought that the Kraken viewed him as a long-term part of this blue line, and apparently they didn't.
No, clearly they didn't. And I mean, it's a long trade showcase if that's what it is.
Yeah.
Basically throughout the whole season, giving him all these opportunities. But whether or not the Kraken viewed him as part of the core, as someone who's really valuable on the blue line, clearly there was that value around the league, and Nashville certainly thinks so. Giving up a second round pick, which is crazy to think about, that's probably the highest single draft pick the Kraken got through all these trades.
Mm-hmm.
You look at where Nashville is in the standings. I'd bet that's probably the highest pick that's going to come out of all of this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's for Jeremy Lauzon, who probably the first real whipping boy and fan whipping boy in Kraken history.
Yeah.
Uh, someone that I know we gave a hard time. I mean, here I'll just read the Ron Francis quote on the Lauzon trade from today. Honestly, in Jeremy's case, he's been good for us. I wasn't really looking to do it, but teams are offering a second round pick, and we felt that was more than a fair value for him. I would agree that is more than a fair value for him, I think.
Yeah. Probably so. Again, kind of fitting in the theme though of somebody who not under contract for next season. Now he was going to be an RFA, not a UFA. That is, a big difference. But again, who knows what conversations Ron Francis had with him about his future in Seattle, about where Lauzon was as far as looking at that kind of stuff. Um, and yeah, it does feel like one of those Nashville probably approached him about something.
Mhm.
And as Francis was kind of kicking the tires on the return, it sounds like that return caught him off guard and surprised him. And it was one of those that he did it yesterday, and while he could, before Nashville might change their mind, kind of thing, rather than push for the best return possible. Like that's almost what that quote says to me. Kind of reading between the lines. I get why Nashville did it. They love their big, strong defenseman. And you know what? If anybody is going to be able to help him kind of put everything together, it is going to be Nashville. Like, that's just what they do. They just turn every defensive prospect ever into a really solid blue liner. So I'm happy for him. He's going to go somewhere that should help him out, go somewhere a little more competitive than Seattle this season. And then, yes, that return, I agree with you. Assuming Nashville doesn't go on some insane playoff run, that is going to be the highest pick that the Kraken get this year from all of these moves. No one could have seen it coming from Lauzon.
Absolutely. I love this trade. Probably the best of the bunch, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fantastic trade. And I think you made a good point, though. Nashville, they love their physical defensemen.
Mm-hmm.
They're good at coaching them up, too. Don't be surprised if Lauzon actually turns into a really productive player for them. A lot of the mistakes he made early on, and, don't get me wrong, he made a lot of mistakes, but most of them were of the very coachable variety.
Mm-hmm.
And, Nashville feels like they can work with him, and I don't doubt that they can.
No, and again, something that we have brought up, he has made huge strides over the course of the season here in Seattle. Like he was not the player leaving us now is not the player that started the season with us. He is
Absolutely.
way better. We were not calling him out night after night the way we were. We were not circling him on video reviews of goals allowed as being the reason why that goal is allowed. Like all of that stuff stopped. So he was putting in the work, and I'm sure that also factored into things for Nashville as well. Joining him though out the door last night, another kind of surprise trade, although maybe not as surprising. Fellow potential RFA Mason Appleton going back to the Winnipeg Jets. RJ, in exchange, the Kraken get Winnipeg's 2023 fourth round pick. So we know the Jets were interested in getting Appleton way back at the expansion draft. Like they did not want to lose Appleton at all. We knew that this was always kind of something on the table. Kraken kind of seemed like they really thought that they had something in Appleton, just like we did before the season started. But for whatever reason, right, things have not worked out in Seattle, and so it gets to go back to Winnipeg.
Yeah, and I mean, good for Mason. First of all, I know he played well there, and you saw a lot of promise there last season. The Jets clearly valued him as a player and continue to value him. And I think this kind of fits into, again, Ron Francis maybe trying to move guys where they want to go. And this was an interesting quote to me from Francis today. I think 4 of the 6 guys that we moved went to places that were probably their first choice if they were getting moved.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously didn't say who the 4 of the 6 were, but I would bet Appleton is probably one of those 4.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's interesting too because this is really the only deal that Winnipeg has made this trade deadline, and they've been very active. That is adding a player. Almost everything else they've been doing has been selling. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I mean? And so that probably opens up potential for Appleton coming back in. We know that was one of the issues with him last year was just he was kind of buried on their depth chart. It's probably going to get a good look now moving forward there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, someone they have really high hopes for. I think it's a good fit for him. Do you think Francis probably suffered on the return a little bit, maybe in trying to get him to go to the right destination?
Maybe a little bit. It's hard. I mean, like I said, when you look at Appleton, when you look at Johansson, given how they were playing this year, given just kind of who they are in general as more depth forwards, you're looking at kind of mid-round picks. That's just the way it is. Now, ideally, you'd like to get that mid-round pick for as soon as possible, draft-wise, so you're not having to really wait around. Because even if you hit on a fourth-round pick, that fourth-round pick's probably taking 2 more years to get to the NHL, and
At the
then
very least.
and then another year before they're substantially productive for you. So in essence, assuming this pick turns into somebody, we're looking at somebody helping out this team literally 5 years from now.
Yep.
Like it's like, all right, okay, we got an asset that maybe 5 years from now is going to be useful for us. It's hard. Like that's just something that's hard to stomach. I get that everybody's excited about how many picks that the Kraken have gotten this deadline, and we'll get to this more so in a little bit. But when you think about it as, well, we lost a player that we had some control over. He was only going to be an RFA for a potential asset 5 seasons from now. It's just kind of one of those like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the value probably a little underwhelming there.
Mm-hmm.
In the big picture, it's fine, but especially for an RFA, that's what confused me.
Mm-hmm.
Because usually when you have the team control, I know it's only for, 1 more year. It's just the end of this year he's an RFA, but still, usually that adds a little bit more.
Exactly. So that one was a little surprising to me. But now we move on to the last deal. We're assuming it's the last deal. We know that there are still several picks
Mm-hmm.
several trades to be announced. Just because of the big backlog that happens every year, trades slowly trickle out. And that was another interesting one. That is Marcus Johansson going back to the Washington Capitals. That's where it all began for him, right? I mean, that's
Yes,
certainly
it
where
is.
he rose to prominence, but yeah.
It's where he began. Yep.
Yep. So going back to the Washington Capitals in exchange for Daniel Sprong. So we actually got a player this time, somebody who could help us out right now, which is kind of needed given how many players have left this lineup. They need some bodies to play.
Exactly. And commit this to memory, everyone, because this is another Kraken first, another trivia answer. Who's the first player the Kraken ever traded for? It's Daniel Sprong.
Yeah, Dutch boy. I love it. And coming back along with Sprong is a 2022 fourth round pick from Washington, and then Washington's 2023 sixth round pick. So I guess my first question for you, RJ, do you think this means Marcus Johansson will go back to being called Marcus Johansson now?
Quite possibly. I mean, if the broadcast team still remembers and all that, because that's what he was called when he was there in Washington. So I think that might be happening.
Yeah, I had a whole Twitter conversation about the many pronunciations he's gone through in his NHL career. It was Johansson there, it was Johansson, and then now it's been Johansson here. So it's been interesting. What is it really? Who knows? Hopefully him, actually. But
yeah, hopefully he knows.
Hopefully he knows. So it's gonna be interesting. But this one also caught me a little off guard because I just thought, again, you're getting something for him back. You're getting a pretty decent return in that, you're kind of getting the same thing as you got for Appleton, but with an additional pick, and certainly then a player in Sprong who we can talk about in a sec that I think is good. But it was one of those also where it was just like, okay, you're just clearing house of every expiring contract now. Like, that's the only thing that we could say. When is Sheahan out the door? Like,
Sheahan would have something to say about that. But I know. Think he might be the only one left.
Yeah. And who knows, right? The trade could come out an hour from now. Sheahan's gone. So, but otherwise, I think it was good value. You're getting back, you're trading a depth forward essentially for a depth forward with a little bit more potential, getting some mid-round picks. Who knows if they'll ever turn into anything, but you're at least helping him out go, try to fight and help the Capitals try to get into the playoffs.
Exactly. It's a nice bit of business, I think, all around for both teams and the player. Johansson, again, he's one of those guys that I certainly wouldn't have put as untouchable. I was surprised to see him move just because I wasn't sure there'd be that interest for him, around the league. And clearly Washington, they know what he can do. They've seen him before. But I just thought that there wasn't going to be enough interest to get him moved to get a deal done. And turns out there was. And Francis, I thought, got a really good return given a player that I didn't even know you could get anything for. So a fourth and a sixth, more than Appleton. And then Daniel Sprong, a player that I know you've liked dating back to his draft year. We have the original footage of you reacting to him being drafted. You're like, oh, that's nice, to your Penguins at that time. So hasn't panned out as well as maybe you thought on that day, but still there's some potential there. And yeah, they'll see what they have. I mean, although this is interesting quote from Francis today on Sprong, because I did ask him about Sprong and Pouliot, the two players they brought in. And here's the quote. That was a player Washington wanted, or that was a player they wanted to get back to us, meaning Washington. Dan is a young player. He's got some skills, so we can come in and we'll give him a look in the last 19 games and see what he can do. So I think that's a player that Washington wanted to get back to us. So I think they were looking to move Sprong to make the money work. I don't know that there's really anything that the Kraken saw in him there, because generally when you ask about a player the team has just acquired, the GM will try and go out, say something nice or say something, oh, we like this or this about him. But I really do think he was kind of thrown in to make the money work. We'll see what he can do, but I wouldn't expect the team to be too high on him at this point.
No, I keyed in on that right away too when I saw the transcript from his statement. I was just like, oh, well, that's interesting. I was like, I guess the best thing you could say about it beyond just, well, they had to do it to make the money work, is that Washington liked him. That is the sense that I got, was that he was liked around the Washington building. So maybe they were like, look, we need to get rid of, maybe it's Sprong and someone else on the roster. Let's give him the chance to maybe go to a team that now really has a lot of openings in it, and maybe you can get some more playing time, and maybe a change of scenery will help him out, because in some ways kind of Ryan Donato-esque coming to the Kraken.
I was thinking about Donato. Yep.
They play a little differently. Donato's got a little bit more of that like power forward edge to him
Mhm.
that Sprong doesn't have. But again, you're bringing in somebody new who's bounced around. Seattle's going to be his fourth team already, and maybe things click for him here. Otherwise, I look at him and this is a guy who twice has been on pace for 20 goals in an NHL season. Like he's not bad. His wrist shot's fantastic. It always has been. That was why I was surprised back in 2015 that he fell to the Penguins at 46th overall, because this is a player who put up a ton of points in the queue, lots of goals, always had that, ability to him. Hasn't quite figured out maybe the rest of the game
Mhm.
to and that's kind of why he's been shipped around from team to team and why he's kind of always buried on depth charts and stuff. But maybe that happens here in Seattle the way it kind of has for Ryan Donato. It could happen. Otherwise, there's a lot worse flyers you could take on than him.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. And eager to see what he can do. Got to talk to him just a little bit, media availability. This morning he said he's plays an offensive style of game. He's got a good shot, when describing his own game. Yeah, we'll see if he's able to get to Arizona in time for the Kraken's next game.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be a real fun thing to see, RJ. What's this team going to look like now from a lineup perspective?
Yeah, I mean, Hackstall basically said this morning, like, look, we're just gonna try and figure everything out tomorrow. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there were no lines in practice this
No.
morning. They had 10 forwards. There were no lines.
Yeah.
D pairs a little bit, but they'll just basically figure it out last minute.
Yeah, I was going to say, do we want to kind of transition into looking at that? Like what we think this roster is going to look like now after all those trades before we get to, the more longer term approach?
Sure. Yeah, let's take a look at that.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, if you count Sprong, the Kraken essentially have 12 forwards on the roster, 6 defensemen on the roster. So exactly how many you would need to play a game,
Hmm.
with no scratches, nothing helping them out. I think defense is the easier place to start. Just bringing up Kale Fleury, right?
Yes. Bringing
It's
up Cale Fleury. And I know they picked up, Derek Pouliot off waivers
mhm.
today. Another quote where I don't think there's a whole lot of expectations for
No,
him. I want to read this just because it's funny.
yeah,
I asked, what'd you like about him? He said, we moved a couple of D out the other day. We've got a couple guys banged up in Charlotte. So as a precaution, to bring some more depth on the back end. He's a former 8th overall pick, so he has some talent. Hopefully we can work with him and see if we can get it all together.
yeah. Another failed Penguins draft pick, by the way. We'll just before everybody points that out to us, yes, we're
Love it.
aware. Um, yeah, former Portland Winterhawk too,
Hmm.
Pouliot. Uh, Interesting player. Yeah, just never figured it out in the NHL. Like,
No, absolutely not. And it's just at the NHL level has looked pretty bad defensively. But
mhm.
the talent was there.
The talent was there on a stacked Portland team. Like that's I think kind of the retrospective looking back on it was, well, he
Hmm.
never had to defend on that Portland team because the rest of the team was so good. He could just focus on being an offensive guy and put up buckets of points every year. I know Pittsburgh thought he was just going to be the next Chris Letang. That's did not happen at all there. So yeah, I think Cale Fleury is probably the guy on defense to get him back up to 7D. It's going to be weird, this team not carrying 8 defensemen. I mean, we're
I
assuming
know,
they're not
right?
going to carry 8 defensemen. Maybe they will.
I looking at the forwards, they might. Maybe they will. I mean, and also Ron Francis, by the way, added that Cole Lind will be up for the rest of the year.
Yeah, Cole Lind is actually counted in the 12 forwards that
Right.
I was talking about. Cole Lind's counted in there along with Sprong. Um, Forward wise, I mean, we've seen Max McCormick several times throughout this year. Alex True, do you think he gets brought back up? Like, what do you think
I
they're
think
doing here?
probably at some point, those are the two guys, True and McCormick. Those are the two we've seen. And looking at the Charlotte stat sheet, those are the only two that really stand out at forward to
Hmm.
me. So I think those are probably the two guys.
Exactly, I agree. But it's going to be interesting. I think the big thing moving forward now from a roster perspective is being able to see Hayden Fleury and Will Borgen in the lineup every night. Right?
Yes,
That's
that's
just
going
going
to
to
be
be
huge.
it's going to be
Yep.
huge for them. Go for it.
And Francis talked about wanting to see what these younger guys can do. You know, he talked about Fleury and Borg and Cole Lind as well, and really giving them a chance to succeed. And I'm so excited to see that.
Yeah, and hey, let's all be thankful that they weren't shipped out too. All on expiring deals, all pending
It's true.
RFAs.
And you know what? Francis actually did, if you believe him, exercise some restraint there. You know, this quote from today, I think you could have looked at making more deals, but then it really depletes you even more. I think as tough as it is to move guys out, it's also tough on the guys that are left behind in that room. So, you know, he was thinking about it. It is something that he had in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I almost wonder if they didn't have a game tomorrow and he could then more reasonably refill this roster to be an actual NHL roster just from a bodies in the room perspective if he would have made more deals.
I think
But
he might have.
but yeah, I mean, because I was looking at it, once it became clear this is what was happening and that RFAs were now on the table after the Lauzon and Appleton deal, I was just like, oh my gosh, here we go. Hayden Fleury. I was like, is there a market for him? He's hardly played. Um, and you know the two names that jumped out forward wise were Donato and Geeky, and I was
Mm-hmm.
like, there would be riots in the streets if he
Yeah,
did that.
can't do that. Cannot do that.
Can't do that. So we get to keep him. It's all good now. All right. So looking at things, RJ, from a future perspective, looking ahead to this off season and future off seasons,
Mm-hmm.
obviously the Kraken have a ridiculous amount of draft picks, like
Oh, yeah.
stupid amounts of draft picks. What it's like 4.5 drafts worth of draft picks in the next three,
Crazy.
insane amounts of draft picks, as well as plenty of cap space moving
Mm-hmm.
forward. And so I do want to give Ron Francis credit for doing both things. I think all along he's wanted to have more of a we're going to build this team and it's going to take time and we want to have that future approach, the 3 to 5 year plan that he was always talking about, right? But I think he's also put the team in a good position to be aggressive in free agency, like he brought up a couple weeks ago, as you know,
And again today.
yeah, as the fan base kind of wanting and ownership is for surely probably wanting. I think that the Kraken are in a really good spot to be more competitive next year after adding pieces in free agency without it necessarily turning into a bad thing for them. Like if they go out and spend big money on a couple of free agents, well, look, you've got a million draft picks coming down the line to fill out your roster with good entry level contracts.
Exactly. And when you look at the big picture, because I think that's kind of what we're transitioning to right
Mm-hmm.
now, I think Ron Francis has put the Kraken in actually a really good spot. And this is as optimistic as I've been about the future of
Mm-hmm.
the team, probably since around the start of the season before we all kind of knew what was up, you know, with what the roster was. And I think Ron Francis kind of laid out the roadmap today as far as what he plans to do and what these draft picks are for. He mentioned he's got 25 draft picks in the next two drafts, which again is crazy. But one thing he said is, I hope I don't make all those picks.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I am hoping I don't have to make all those picks. He wants to move some of those picks to get help. I mean, that's what the plan is. I mean, he mentioned, you know, we didn't do all this to draft and develop and be good 5 years from now. We did this to give us the tools to try and be better next season, and that's what our goal is. And he kind of explained it like this. He said, if you're making trades and you want to bring in a player to help the roster get better now, what teams are asking for is either draft picks
Mm-hmm.
or, you know, prospects, guys you've already drafted, like a Matty Beniers or a Riker Evans. And he said, you know, we don't want to give up those guys, obviously, and you certainly don't.
No.
And then when it comes to draft picks, he said, look, we only had 7 draft picks. Our pipeline isn't isn't what other teams are, just by virtue of how little time we've been around. But now that we've acquired all these draft picks, that gives us some ammunition to go and add players potentially, to go and find things that can improve our roster. And we've seen Ron Francis do this before. I think of the Teuvo Teravainen deal
Mm-hmm.
in Carolina. That's certainly something that, with what the Kraken had before the deadline, was not open to them. They did not have anything to give up that would make sense in a deal like that. But now they do. And I think it's going to be a really interesting offseason because Francis is going to be open for business and he's going to be looking to weaponize those picks because I think that mandate still exists basically from ownership to compete sooner rather than later.
Right, and I love that because that's where I'm kind of looking at things too. because as I brought up earlier with a fourth round pick, best case scenario for a fourth round pick is that it's helping your NHL club in 3 years after you make that pick. Realistically, 4 if it's going to be someone who's going to be a good NHL player long term. And I'm not trying to say that, oh, nobody's ever been found in the fourth round. I could go down a long list of very good fourth round picks, many of whom were traded for higher picks literally today.
Yes.
I was kind of surprised as I was going down the list. I was just like, or certainly at this deadline, Andrew Kopp, Ben Sherratt, former fourth round picks, is pretty interesting there. And there's tons and tons of great players. Johnny Gaudreau was a fourth round pick. Just, all right, you can really find good players in the fourth round. But again, they're not going to help you overnight. And your odds of finding the Johnny Gaudreau in the fourth round, you could have 100 drafts and maybe only find one of them. So they don't excite me that much. I love the idea of saying, oh, we've got 25 picks in the next 2 drafts. But I'm like, realistically, you still only have your own first round pick in each of those 2 drafts. That's, I think, the thing that sticks with me, because in the NHL, the drop off between round 1 and round 2 is big. Certainly round 2 to 3 and anything beneath that is large as well. But even within the first round, the drop off from like the top 20 to then, 21 through 32 is really big in the NHL. And so I really hope that he gets aggressive and either trades a lot of these second round picks, either packages them for established players that can help out the club next year, or to trade into the first round, because I think that's really just the way to go for any team, but I think especially for the Kraken as they try to build, round out their core and build to be competitive sooner rather than later.
Exactly. And I agree with your standpoint on the draft picks. And yeah, again, I hope he doesn't make all those draft picks. But I'm interested to see him kind of weaponize those picks. And at the end of the day, draft picks are essentially currency. That's the currency that you have in the NHL when you're trying to make trades, when you're trying to get things done. And, the Kraken did not have a whole lot of currency before this. They build that up, and they are going to be free to use that in different ways this offseason.
Yeah, and I will remind everyone, though, this is, again, where my cynical hat comes on. They are currency up until you have to make that pick. And we have seen teams die on that, too, where all of a sudden they do get stuck with maybe having 10, 11 picks in a draft because they did not properly utilize it ahead of time. They kept holding out for something better, whatever it may be, and all of a sudden you're stuck having to make all those picks. And as in any draft, it is an inexact science, and most of those picks are not going to work out for you. And so it's one of those, it's great that we have the currency, but then it just, talk about how horrible it must be to be a general manager, RJ, that you can do all this work, get all these picks, and then it just immediately becomes, okay, well, what are you going to do with them now? Right? Like, you're never in a winning situation, because there is always something that comes after that. And what comes after this trade deadline is, okay, how are we going to use those picks? How are we going to utilize them? What are we turning them into? Do you have a preference on, would you rather see an established player trade versus just maybe, lumping all these second rounders together and getting, 2 additional late first rounders? Like, do you have kind of a preference?
It depends on kind of the players that are there and what you see. I know there are certain guys that'll drop and that maybe you're interested. I think it gives you the option to do it, which is just nice to have. And I do trust the Kraken scouting staff from what they've done so far. Very good early returns on guys like Riker Evans and Ryan Winterton, who are in that second to third round mix.
Yep.
And I think for the 2022 picks, it's not the worst thing in the world if the Kraken maybe get stuck with 1 or 2 more picks than they were hoping to have, because of how limited the prospect pool is. I think they're in a unique situation where even if you do get caught holding the picks, it's not like you can't use them to expand you're not going to overload the prospect pool. Certainly not this year. So I think that works out okay. But yeah, I think it's something that certainly if the scouts are telling you there's this guy that's, probably an early to mid first round talent who's fallen into the end of the first, Francis, I think, should package a couple of those together, go up and get him.
Yeah. A Daniel Sprong, perhaps.
Yep. Find the next Daniel Sprong.
Gosh, but you don't want that either. It is interesting. Yeah. 'Cause draft picks are always fascinating to me in sports, and especially in the NHL, because it's not like baseball where you have, you know, five teams worth of roster you have to fill out with,
Right.
you know, your 100 draft picks every year. And it's not like the NFL either, where everybody's older and they're so valuable because your third round pick is going to be a starter on your team. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like that at all either. It is really unique, and I always love the ridiculous concept too. Every, you know, draft day and on the draft floor, just being around there, RJ, how, you know, that second round pick is so much in that morning, and then it
Mm-hmm.
literally, you can watch the value of it plummet as the day goes on, and then the moment you pick somebody with it, that prospect is worthless.
It's
As
like a new car, drive it off the
Yeah,
lot and it loses most of its value.
yeah,
It's true. Because there's all the possibilities in the world if you were to, pick that
uh-huh,
and have another team actually pick their guy, but the chances
right.
are that your guy is their guy, very little.
Exactly, and it's one of those that the closer it gets time to that pick vesting,
Hmm.
essentially, it's it just loses money. It's crazy. It loses value. It's a really weird concept. So I would like to see in the off season any sort of deals get done sooner rather than later. That being said, realistically, you know, by the time the cup finals usually end, it's only a week before the draft. Usually, they get
Yeah.
like a weekend in Vegas to do the award show, and then everybody's off to where the draft is held, which I believe is Montreal this year. So
Yep.
it's going to be interesting what the Kraken do, because again, the other thing was, not only are they second round picks, they are low second round picks. All of these.
Yes. Pretty much all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the Kraken one won't be, and I think that's what helped them out with Riker Evans and Ryan Winterton, was they were essentially taken at the top of each round.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think for a lot of these low seconds, maybe you're looking at like the Winterton type of thing, where
Hmm.
it's almost like a high third.
Yeah, and so it is one of those things. The value, it drops off very quickly. I don't know if you want to get into the pick value charts and stuff, RJ, or if you feel
Yeah,
like we've
why
kind of
not?
covered it. Okay.
No, I think let's real quick because I think this is interesting to look at and something that anyone who likes learning about this side of hockey, the
Hmm.
roster moves, all that kind of stuff, should probably look at because it's something I find very entertaining and I think it'll inform a lot of trades, especially that you'll see on draft day.
Right,
Um,
and maybe it'll
but
help keep people from getting too mad at me when I'm just like, yeah, okay, we got all these picks. It doesn't mean anything.
that's the most important part of all of this,
Yeah,
preventing people from getting mad at Dylan.
exactly.
But anyway, I mean, we shared on Twitter, and Dylan shared it first, and I stole it for for the ECH account. Thank you for contributing that, Dylan.
Yeah.
But anyway, we shared a couple draft pick value charts last night on our Twitter, which you can go back and find. But the one we shared is from the Athletic, and it uses a metric called GSVA, which stands for Game Score Value Added, and basically that's game score and game score value added are metrics created by Dom over at the Athletic, and it kind of uses some traditional metrics, some more advanced metrics, but basically assigns like a game score value essentially to a player's performance, and then game score value added is kind of a number that shows that player's impact essentially on adding games wins to his team, kind of like war, wins above replacement, kind of like that. But anyway, it helps you kind of compare one pick to the other as far as value added. And so you look at that chart, and I believe I remember we were looking at maybe pick 25 for the
Hmm.
Leafs because we were talking about the Geo trade, and assuming the Leafs get pick 25 because that's what they had last year.
Hmm.
Um, the the total game score value added for pick 25 of the draft was, do you have the charts open in
Yeah,
front of
it's
you?
it's 3.4.
Is 3.4. Whereas if you look at two second rounders that are pick 25 of the second round,
Right.
each one of those is going to be worth, I believe, 1.3.
Yep.
So for a total of 2.6. So that shows you, at least from that model, and that's kind of using past draft results,
Hmm.
that 2 seconds is going to be worth less than a low first.
Right, because those 2 seconds are lower in the second round. If
Yes.
you have a high, 37th overall in a draft, that's worth 2.3. Yeah, 37th, 38th, you're getting better value. than it. But realistically, looking at the picks that the Kraken got back, this is what I was saying was important. Was they got Florida's second round pick, that's going to be very low. Toronto's second round pick, that is going to be very low. Nashville's, it's not going to be as low, but it's not going to be high either, potentially, especially if they make the playoffs. So it is one of those things where the value that we were hoping for, like in the Geo trade, a lot of people were like, well, 2 seconds, it's, it's rather than a first, that's kind of like the same thing. It isn't. It's just not when you're talking about playoff bound teams that are going to be competitive. It isn't. It is not equivalent value. And so it's just one of those things. And like I said, the drop off from pick 20 in a draft at a 4.0 GSVA value to pick 50 in a draft, which is at 1.6. Like, that's huge. I know it's only 30 picks. It's essentially a round's worth of players taken in between them. But that is a huge difference in being a top 6 player versus a bottom 6 player in a lot of ways. And so,
exactly.
And so that's one of those things where this is why okay, the Kraken can have a ton of picks. And if you add up the value of all those picks, if they all work out, especially those mid-round ones, and they eventually come to your roster years from now, maybe you can get better value than if you bundle these to try to move into the lower end of the first round. But I just think when it's all said and done, you are just better off trying to get as many first rounders as possible, bundling those picks if you can find someone who's willing to do it, to trade into the first round, because the value is just so much higher there. And the miss rate is so much lower too, which I don't know gets totally worked into all this as well. You know what I mean? Like,
yes, exactly.
Like, does someone who never makes it to the NHL get factored in this? I don't know. So it's just one of those things. I just think for the Kraken, if they're not going to trade those picks for established NHL players, I want to see as many of them bundled for as high a pick as possible.
Agreed. And I think it's something they should certainly be open to. And just cool to look at, the value of those different picks. And that's, again, why we were kind of, had that sticking point about the first round pick, and why we kind of really wanted the first round pick to be the return in the Geo deal, because it is worth more than 2 seconds. And there is a difference there. And, again, you can weigh the whole, you want to do the right thing by Geo, all that stuff. Totally legitimate argument, but just know that, yes, you are sacrificing value for that.
Exactly. And I hate to be like, like I said, putting on my cynical hat when it comes to this thing, because I know how excited so much of the fan base has been the last 2 days on Twitter, RJ, because of how many picks we have, because it is so crazy. Like, this is the stuff we would do in an NHL game or on Eastside Hockey, RJ, right? We've got a team, get like 1 million draft picks and just be able to do whatever we want every draft, because that's just really fun. And certainly from an armchair GM standpoint, that's the dream, is just to have all of these draft picks. But at the end of the day, you can have 1 million 4th round picks. There's still very few of them are going to help you, and they're not going to help you for a long time. And so
that is true, but that's not a reason not to be excited, because draft picks are currency, and Ron Francis is now in a position to spend. It's going to be a very exciting offseason.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fantastic. Forsberg, let's go. No extension announced in Nashville.
Yes.
But stayed in Nashville. I don't know. I think there's going to be something there. If not, Johnny Gaudreau.
Yep.
Not a bad consolation prize.
Exactly. If Forsberg resigns, if maybe a Gaudreau resigns, then that just means it's all that more important to have the currency to go out and get guys via trade, because that's going to be the avenue that you're going to have.
Yes, and I would love to go around looking, RJ, for guys that the Kraken could trade for with these picks, but that would take...
we're going to do that at some point.
I was going to say, that's going to be something that we're going to have to save for at least NHL playoff time, when we're going to be freed up schedule-wise. Not as much going on with the Kraken, because otherwise it would take hours for us to go through each roster and really try to look at all these things.
Hours that we'd love to spend doing that.
Right. Going to bring this up because just announced another Seattle Kraken trade. Okay. The Seattle Kraken are getting Victor Rask with 50% of his salary retained by the Minnesota Wild in exchange for future considerations.
Oh, that was my favorite player. Dang it.
I know. So, do you think those future considerations will literally turn into anything, RJ? Because sometimes they don't.
Do they ever?
Maybe once in a while somebody's like, hey, I kind of like this guy in the 6th round. He's, my son's friend. Let's just do this.
Yep.
And they'll be like, all right, I guess I owed you one.
Yep. No, seriously, sometimes they do turn into things behind the scenes like that. I don't know that we'll ever know what those future considerations are. I believe Minnesota's retaining salary on that deal.
Yeah, 50%. They're retaining 50%.
Yep. So that makes sense. I mean, there's history there with Ron Francis and Carolina, and if I read correctly, I think Rask is going to be reporting to Charlotte.
Yes.
Okay. So I think Rask probably, could use a change of scenery. It wasn't really working out for him in Minnesota. He knows Ron Francis. There's a history there. And most importantly, Dylan, they got your boy. You've talked about acquiring Victor Rask a couple times. I think he was the guy that you maybe even wanted the Kraken to get from Minnesota in the expansion draft, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, well, I didn't realize what all the center options were going to be and everything for this team. I thought that he might be a good choice for them there. But yeah, it's all right. He's been fine. Point per game guy in Iowa.
That's something.
That is something. You can't tell me that the Kraken would be in a worse place today if they had taken Rask instead of Susie.
I guess in the standings, no. You know what?
See? So, maybe things would have worked out after all. But yeah, happy to have him. I think we're going to see him at some point before the season's over up in Seattle.
I would think so too. And it's not going to hurt, really. I mean, just take a look, see what you've got. It just makes sense. And the Rask thing, though, I got to, tell the story behind it real quick. It was kind of weird. We finished with the in-person questions at the Ron Francis presser today. And so then it goes to the Zoom questions. And the first one comes from Ryan Clark from The Athletic. And it was a 2-part question. But one of the parts was, is there anything you could tell me about Victor Rask and the Minnesota Wild and any kind of deal there? And Ron Francis says, no, I can't. I'm not going to comment on that right now. Maybe we can talk about it later. And so we all just kind of look at our heads because we hadn't heard anything about Rask. But credit to Ryan Clark. He's got his sources. He was on that well before any of us were. So yeah, cool to see that all come together after knowing about it for a while.
Exactly. I think that was the one thing that we had any sort of inkling might happen. Glad we were able to squeeze that in there right here before the end of the podcast too. Because
good timing.
How perfect deep dive would it have been if the moment we stopped recording that was announced?
I know, right? That would be fitting.
It would be. So that's our deep dive into this trade deadline for the Kraken, everybody. As always, let us know, tweet at us, leave comments on YouTube. Let us know your thoughts. You've been doing a pretty good job of letting us know your thoughts about everything all day, actually. We've been having a lot of fun on Twitter. It's been great as always. But let us know your thoughts as you think about it. Let us know what you think of those trade value charts, the draft pick value charts and everything. And, where you kind of stand with what you'd like to see Ron Francis do with all these picks. You want to see him make all those picks? You want to see him traded for an established NHL player this offseason? Or do you want to, see if you can just bundle them all up and get, I don't know, RJ, maybe the first overall pick? Just do a 35 picks for one. See if you can make that happen with Montreal if they're there.
If I was the Habs, I'd think about it.
I mean, everybody would think about it. And I think the team taking the first overall pick might be able to actually say they got the better end of that deal. Certainly from the value standpoint, you would.
Yep.
So that's going to do it for this one, everybody. Thanks for being patient as this was kind of late getting out. We obviously needed to wait until the deadline was over so that we had the full picture and to hear Ron Francis. Thanks, RJ, for being there and reporting on all that, because I think that answered a lot of questions people were having both from yesterday and today. And with that, we are going to see you all next time.